Welcome to Arts and the Humanities in the UK today. Where next? I can see that participants are just still dropping in, but it's getting, the numbers are slowing up. I'm waiting for the magical number of 100, which would be really lovely. Oh yes, we're getting up there. My name is Claire Lees. I'm the director of the Institute of English Studies at the School of Advanced Study, where I'm also Vice Dean. And it's a particular pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion. This discussion is in part occasioned by the HEPI report on humanities in the UK today, What's Going On, authored by Marion Thain, who's with us today, Executive Dean of Arts and Humanities at King's College London. And we also have with us today Nigel Harkness, who is PVC Pro Vice Chancellor for Social Sciences and the Humanities at Newcastle University, and one of the co-authors of the report. So part of this event is occasioned by that, but part of this is sponsored by the School of Advanced Study, because we wanted to acknowledge the widespread recognition across the arts and humanities sector of the rapid and shifting changes in the humanities landscape, which is impacting differentially in terms of institution, geographic region, and subject area. Now, the impacts are being felt now and will dramatically shift the landscape going forward in the future. So the School of Advanced Study wanted to acknowledge that, and our three other speakers today all have deep reaches into their subject communities, individually, collectively, across learned societies and organizations and different institutions. And our speakers are Charles Burdett, Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies, Katherine Harloe, Institute of Classical Studies, and Barry Smith from the Institute of Philosophy. So across the panelists today, we have a fair representative of some of the subject areas of arts and humanities, by no means all of them. And I think that's important to acknowledge. And what we have done is we've invited each speaker to speak for precisely 5 minutes and no more, to offer 3 points that reflect on and point the way forward for the future of arts and humanities, whether it's in terms of research landscapes, directions and priorities. We will then, at that point, after those 5 minutes, open up for question and answers. Please post your Q&A questions in the Q&A section, and we'll keep an eye on that. I'll also invite the panelists to speak to each other and develop a conversation. It's important to be doing this work at the moment. It's important that we hear from and listen to and respond to the community. And with that in mind, I turn the mic, as it were, over to Professor Marion Thain, a colleague of mine in English Studies.
Thanks very much, Claire. And I've just started my timer, so I'll be sure to keep to time. So my 3 points, some of my points have sub-points, but let me go with the first of the 3, which is I think we need to reframe the national narrative around the humanities. This is in key part because we're too often on the defensive. We too often only get engaged in the conversation when we need to defend our subjects, and that always positions us in a reactive state, in what often looks like a reactionary state as well. And I think we need to get out there and do much more proactive, positive communications rather than always seeming to be defensive. So what would this consist of? It would consist of sharing a lot more about what we actually do rather than what stereotypes of us from 20, 30, 40 years ago think we do. And they tend to be very, very narrow around the arts, about painting and poetry. But what we actually do with poetry, why that work's important, I think people really generally don't know, and it's up to us to share that. I also think as part of this reframing of the national narrative, the narrative of crisis has really not been helpful. It's very undermining and destructive to our current students. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when it gets repeated often enough, because that's what students are hearing when they're choosing their degree subjects. We really need to move away from that particular phrase and that narrative. And then I guess my third sub point within this point is to think about the data narratives, because we've spent far too long with what seem to be incontrovertible data points that tell us the humanities is in decline. And it's not that humanities enrollments aren't in some cases falling or static within a growing market. It's not to pretend those things aren't happening. It's a question of actually looking at what that means and what kind of picture that's really reflecting. So I would say that many of the more traditional disciplines are losing out on market share to more vocational disciplines, but that has been true in many cases in the sciences as much as the humanities. That's not a humanities problem. It's a shifting in the whole landscape that we've seen towards, business studies, more vocationally leaning degrees. And I think the story we need to tell and the conversation we need to start having around that is actually, it may have been the case in previous years that you secure a good position in one of these traditional vocational areas and you're set for life. Is that likely to continue to be the case in the future when AI is going to take over a lot of the functions, perhaps within law, perhaps within medicine? We need to be thinking about what the world is going to look like in the future, much further down the line. What are the jobs that we don't yet know are going to exist? What would those look like? How can we give students the broadest possible skills base and the broadest possible opportunities? That might push us to think in a rather different direction about what the most desirable education looks like. And students might start to think about broadening their foundation and not going for a slightly narrower training that will deliver them, yes, more directly to a job, but will it be a good underpinning for a very long and varied career, which is what we know a good deal of our young people are much more likely to have these days. The world is not as it was. There are a lot of unknown unknowns, but we have to do some future proofing for the sort of education that we offer. My second point is that we need to continue to evolve, as humanities disciplines have always evolved, but I think we need to speed that up. I think we need to do more innovative repackaging of our skills, of what it is we actually do. I think what we actually do is of great value. It's not about doing something different, but I think it is repackaging it to take it out to people in a different way, to meet them more where they are, where the current concerns are out there in the population. And that's as true of, this is not a presentist argument, this is true of what we do in classics as it is of what we do in any other discipline. And I think we can do that, and we are doing it, and we need to continue to do it. And we do need to recognise that that's very often most effectively done by, as somebody said this morning, those institutions that are at the hard end of things now. They have had to do that, and we can learn a lot from them. My third point is that we need to be much more collaborative broadly across the disciplines. We need a much more radical notion of interdisciplinarity to grow the impact of what we do. Is through collaboration with medicine, with science, with business studies, with all of the rest of them, that we will prove our real worth and create those impacts. Not any one of our disciplines in isolation, but collectively we'll do that. And we need to show how humanities can convene those conversations and lead on those conversations, not just be an addition to those conversations. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks very much, Marion. So I've jotted down reframe, repackage, and radical interdisciplinarity as 3 takeaways from your presentation. I'll now turn to Nigel. I invite Nigel to take over with his 5 minutes.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Marion. There will perhaps inevitably be a little bit of me echoing what Marion says here, since I'm also picking up some of the points from the HEPI report. We were asked to think about future directions and priorities for the UK's arts and humanities sector, with a particular focus on supporting and promoting research. And I think in that context, I'm going to start with what is probably a very obvious point, but I think we need to acknowledge it. The future health of the arts and humanities research base is closely bound up with the health of our education programs. And that's true across the HE sector. We know that because that's where the bulk of our funding as arts and humanities disciplines comes from, perhaps in and that does mark a difference from some of our STEM counterparts, and it's implicit in the HEPI report when we talk about that redistribution of humanities numbers across the sector, and Marion has acknowledged that in what she said as well. That humanities education portfolio is one that is diversifying, and I'd agree with Marion that we need to tell that story much better because it is not fully understood. There is still a focus on some of those single honours degree numbers where we know that there's a huge number of students now taking joint honours programmes, and as the report points to as well, a real growth in interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary programmes such as the liberal arts. My second point is one that I learned from early on in my career as a lecturer in modern languages, and that is the importance of speaking with a clear, unified voice and articulating a powerful value proposition. In this case, I think it's crucial that value proposition is shared across the arts, the humanities, and the social sciences spectrum, and crucially, obviously, by our colleagues in STEM disciplines. So this is where the work of organisations like the School of Advanced Study, the Arts and Humanities Alliance, the Scottish Arts and Humanities Alliance, all come into play. And I want to acknowledge as well the British Academy's leadership here in developing the SHAPE proposition, that is social sciences, humanities and arts for people and the economy. That gives us some organising principles, I think, for that narrative. And I think in developing this value proposition, this strong value proposition, I think it's also where a really strong AHRC influencing and shaping those future cross-council, cross-research council calls in UKRI is making a difference. So I think as a disciplinary group, we are telling our story better. We need to continue to do so, as Marion has said. And the HEPI report gives just a small cross-section of some of the stories and some of the case studies that we can draw on to do this. Finally, HEPI report draws on some previous analysis of the UK research and development landscape, where references to arts and humanities in some of those key publications, or rather the absence of reference to the arts and humanities, or the paucity of reference to the arts and humanities in those research and development policy briefs, suggest that the UK government is conceiving research and development from quite a narrow technological perspective, rather than really drawing in the diversity, the innovation, the applied nature of a lot of humanities research in the UK. I think, as the HEPI report says, humanities are a unique asset that could really fuel current and future governments' ambitions for the UK to be a global science superpower. And I'd add here that I think the recent NERSE review of the UK's research, development and innovation organisational landscape, that's a report that was published after we'd signed off on the proofs for the HEPI report, maybe gives us a little bit more hope. I did a search this afternoon. There are 13 substantive references to arts and humanities in about 125 pages, but that's about 4 times as much as most of the previous reports. It really emphasises that permeability, the importance of the permeability between sectors, disciplines and organisations as one of the 10 key attributes for a successful research and development landscape. So with that in mind, if collaboration across sectors, across disciplines, across organisations, across institutions is key to a successful RDI landscape, how do we as an arts and humanities community perhaps best respond to this? How can we organise to really realise this opportunity and not become invisible in those collaborations, which I think is sometimes the case. So I'd ask perhaps some questions in conclusion. What are the optimal structures internally in our universities and research organisations that will enable us to scale up that existing work across disciplines and sectors? But also, how do we come together at city, regional, national and international level to maximise the complementarity of provision across our institutions and to leverage the partnerships that we have, those partnerships with commercial, charity, cultural and policy sectors that are absolutely integral to the diversity of the modern UK humanities landscape.
Thank you, Nigel. That was fantastic, and really comprehensive coverage from the articulating the absolutely critical pipeline between education and research, the importance of a clear value proposition for arts and humanities alongside our colleagues in social sciences, and indeed in the UK RI research landscape more generally, and the importance of influencing and helping to determine research and development policy going on. And welcome your comments about the nurse report. I think Barry Smith may have something to say about that later on. A key word that we've been discussing in the school is porosity. So there's I think porosity and complementarity very much go together here. Okay, thank you so much, Marion and Nigel. Now I'm going to turn to my colleagues in the school, starting with Charles Burdett.
Thank you, Claire. I'm going to make 3 points quite quickly, playing off the excellent HEPI report and referring to modern languages. My first point regards the current situation of the disciplinary area. As is mentioned in the report, modern languages has certainly faced many challenges over recent years regarding, for example, student recruitment or the closure of departments in different parts of the country. This is a situation that has a range of consequences for the provision of the subject, and especially for postgraduate and postdoctoral researchers. But it's also a significant societal issue. When we're confronted by the effects of accelerated climate change, by the expansionist intention of the world's authoritarian regimes, or by the manifold legacies of colonialism, then there's clearly an urgent need to think in more global terms and develop a specialist cultural and linguistic knowledge that enables us to do so. And I think modern languages has a role of unarguable importance to perform. But one might argue also that facing a series of challenges can prove productive. It imposes upon the disciplinary area the need to reflect on itself, on its objects of studies, its methodologies, its communicative strategies, its self-definition. It imposes on the subject area the need to think about its location within the educational landscape, how it can strengthen its connections not only with schools, but with community associations. It imposes the need for organizations that represent the discipline to act in a way that is as inclusive, as joined up, and as impactful as possible. Though the British Academy and the University Council for Modern Languages, for example, perform an essential function in producing policy reports on the questions that most affect the subject area, the proposals contained in such reports stand little chance of proving effective unless they're accompanied by sustained sector-wide engagement. Which brings me to my second point, and that concerns the application of modern languages. A more coherently organized disciplinary entity is better able to articulate the relevance and purpose of its study, and that's very clear in the report. It's not just policymakers and employers that make calls for relevance. It's the subject community itself, as the AHRC Language Research Fellows have revealed, that wants more emphasis on climate action, health and well-being, education, reducing inequalities, promoting peace and justice. The question is how you demonstrate the application of the work of the subject area, its ability to address real-world issues, to address sustainable development goals, to make demonstrable cultural, social, and economic impacts. And I think there are a number of ways that you can do this, all of these very much revealed in the report. You can use the REF data not just to learn about how to write a good impact case study, but how you can show what the subject community does. You can integrate the findings of the REF with subject benchmarking statements. It's important that these documents are living, disseminated documents. You can not only promote interdisciplinary approaches, but provide the connections and infrastructure to facilitate this kind of research for academics at whatever career stage. You can integrate this with a revised definition of the importance of the discipline. But in order to do so, you need to involve the whole community and to follow a step-by-step approach that ensures both the buy-in of the community and properly organised follow-up activity. Which brings me to my third point, and that concerns training. It's not just the nature of the humanities that is changing, but the nature of the researcher that is changing. Within the disciplinary community, there's an extremely strong appetite for training. We should be thinking about what the researcher in the discipline is going to look like and how we can provide the wider set of disciplinary competencies that they will need. We do this to a degree, of course, already, but we need to continue to emphasize this. We need to continue developing training that integrates humanities and social science methodologies, that involves fieldwork, data analysis, addressing sustainable development goals, that shows how to work with policymakers and NGOs, that shares the innovations of specific research projects and impact case studies, that exemplifies co-production and creativity. And just to conclude, we should not lose sight in any way of what many people would regard as the bedrock of our disciplinary identity, quite the reverse, the study of literary and visual production as the lens through which we interpret language, culture, and society, or the emphasis on linguistic and cultural translation. I could go on, of course, but that identity is in the process of being significantly expanded. The imperative is to ensure that the process involves the whole community and that it's appropriately staged and coordinated. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Charles. I can't summarize your elegant sentences, but I can take away from your presentation a real emphasis, and I think a welcome one, on the arts and humanities as a place for critical self-reflection that is shot through all our disciplines. The centrality of languages in the arts and humanities, and as a place where we can collectively address real-world global challenges. So subject reflection, subject positioning in the world, and finally, and most critically, involving the whole community. And I think this evening is a step towards trying to do that. Thank you so much. Katherine, over to you.
Thanks, Claire. Well, my brief was to give a perspective from classics, and I thought the best way to start would be by telling you about the workshop I'll be attending next weekend, organised by my institute in collaboration with Manchester Metropolitan Centre for Youth Studies. Called Ancient World Studies and Fairer Societies, it'll bring together classical researchers within and without universities at various career stages to share projects that have engaged with young people aged 0 to 25, in the areas of education, community care and policy. We'll be hearing about ways classical researchers inform the development of oracy and literacy education in schools, handling sensitive topics like trauma and sexual violence in the PSHE and RSE curriculum, initiatives around support and integration of communities of migrants and refugees in the UK, many of whom come from regions of the world with significant material and intangible classical heritage. The results of projects engaging with autistic and LGBTQ youth, online and in the context of schools, cultural institutions and community organisations, the presence of classics in prisons and in pupil referral units in many parts of the country and in the military. Last week too, I had the pleasure of attending Fragments, a multidisciplinary professional theatre production staged at the Playground in West London, which explored dynamics of perception, cognitive processing and memory through the story of papyrologists working to reconstruct a lost Greek tragedy. The post-show panel I chaired was gloriously interdisciplinary, featuring a neuroscientist, a modelarker, and the curator of ancient and medieval manuscripts at the British Library. And when I look at the impact case studies submitted to the Classics panel in REF 2021, I can find many other examples where classical research has, as the HEPI report emphasises, contributed to crucial agendas at local, national and international level. From turning to the deep past to generate insights into sustainable building practices and environmental hacks, to stimulating local communities and economies through engagement with heritage sites, supporting creative industries through collaborations with TV companies, theatre and video game designers, to, on the international stage, restorative work and capacity building in post-conflict zones like Iraq. Engaging and influencing the cultural policies of hard-to-reach states like the Islamic Republic of Iran, and influencing policy at a national and international level around issues such as gender equality or the 2015 UNESCO policy on World Heritage and Sustainable Development. So there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that classical research being conducted today in UK universities is contributing, as the report emphasises, collaboratively, critically and imaginatively with a global and a transhistorical perspective to addressing the key challenges of our age. And it's thriving in this manner despite that narrative of decline or crisis that Marion talked about, which we've certainly been living with for a long time in classics, and that this report highlights the need to take on. One could tell the story of classics in the UK as one of decline, from the removal of Greek and Latin requirements for university entrance in the 20th century, the decline of teaching of our subjects in state schools, the closing of many departments in the 1980s, leading to us occupying a much smaller footprint in universities today than we did before 1950. But small doesn't mean unimportant. And in any case, concerted efforts by classicists, again, within and without universities, have even begun to reverse some of what I just talked about. So there now exist routes for classical subjects to be taught in schools as means of fulfilling the compulsory requirements of the national curriculum in England and the curriculum for excellence in Scotland. We're seeing an expansion of PGCE training programmes, entries for classical civilization, A-level, are at a 20-year high, and in 2022, the Westminster government announced a £4 million Latin Excellence Programme investing in Latin language teaching in the state primary sector. So for me, I recognise the report's emphasis that there's a lot we can be confident about. Classics is alive and well. But my 3 points, which I will say in a list, are around challenges, because I think that's part of what we need to think about with regard to where next. My first is around visibility, not just the point that Nigel has made about visibility in high government level RD policy, but also actually visibility at institutional level strategies in the university sector. This came through very strongly in the REF reports of the subpanel, that actually classicists seem to be better at engaging with non-academic communities around research and research impact than they are necessarily with the overall research infrastructure and strategies of the institutions in which our units exist. And there's a work to be done here, I think, about getting institutions to take seriously the value of arts and humanities research, not just government. The second, which Charles has touched on, is around training and pipelines, finding ways to value and promote this work. There's a generational divide here. A lot of the energy, the amazing work is being undertaken by people with relatively recent PhDs in relatively precarious positions. And it's not that mid-career people don't want to do it, but they haven't had the kind of training that the AHRC is now thinking about introducing. They don't necessarily have the track record, and even people who want to connect with engaged research in this way are seeking support, seeking opportunities to understand and learn how to do it. And my third challenge is just implied by the first two, the need to support humanities and classics across our sector. The threats to humanities provision, especially in post-92s, which this report acknowledges but doesn't really address, threaten us all. In classics, it's been really heartening to see the way in which our subjects have gained a footprint again in the post-92 sector. And we are seeing setbacks here. This diversity of provision opens up new perspectives, new engagements within our discipline, but also if we do believe that humanities degrees can equip graduates with the skills needed for future jobs in a changing world, and that this is needed to address 21st century challenges, we need to maintain access to our subjects in a range of higher educational institutions across all regions of the UK. Classics has been in the situation where our footprint has been shrunk to a few Russell Group institutions. We're much more healthy, we flourish and we contribute more when we are spread across the sector. That's the end of my comments, Claire.
Thanks very much, Katherine. I can see some real connections across the presentations now, particularly about visibility, developing a new narrative for our various, a new and clear and coherent narrative for our various disciplines within the arts and humanities, and a very strong message about diversity of practice institutionally and across are the regions, geographically widespread. That's a real challenge to articulate. And with that in mind, thank you, Katherine. I'll turn to our final speaker, Barry Smith.
Thanks very much, Claire. So I want to talk a little bit about interdisciplinarity and draw some morals about long-range interdisciplinarity, and especially with STEM subjects. The report points out, not unreasonably, there have been some rather unhelpful remarks by government and by recent industrial strategy reports suggesting that there must be greater emphasis on STEM. But the thing to point out is that our colleagues in STEM are quite often reaching out to us, especially at the moment, especially in an uncertain world with challenges that are not going to be addressed by any single discipline, to look for what value humanities can contribute to their research. Now, I'm going to look at three different cases of that and draw some morals if I can. And they're from the first two parts of STEM, from science, first three parts from science, technology and engineering. Mathematics has always been considered an art subject in the ancient Scottish universities, so I won't comment on that. But if we look at the sciences, very often now the sciences are turning to the humanities to provide wider context for their work, to look at a human dimension that they think is maybe being overlooked or missing, to look for historical precedents. And that way of filling in or adding to or complementing what they do with what they think is missing from a 360-degree view, that's important, and it's complementarity. But it's also worth stressing, in the name of complementarity, my first point, there are things the humanities are going to notice and benefit from by dealing with the sciences. In my own field of philosophy, and in I think many other people's fields, the very evidence we work with and the data we take for granted have sometimes been disrupted by looking at recent scientific discoveries. As somebody who, as a philosopher, worked on the senses, it was very hard to recognize that Aristotle was completely wrong, and we don't just have 5 senses and they don't work independently of one another. My colleagues in neuroscience will tell us we've maybe got 22 or 33 and that they're all interacting. If we look at memory, if we look at pain, if we look at lots of other topics that are of consideration to the humanities and to the arts, recent findings will give us a new way of thinking about them. And that enriches what we do, because if we start from the wrong base, however clever we are, we will not get to something that brings genuine insight. So refreshing the information we start from is important. So that's complementarity. If we look at technology, you don't have to have been out of doors long to recognize the alarm and anxiety among researchers and the wider public about AI. And what we see here is the potential to transform the subjects we're working on by both considering the impact of technology and what the benefits are, as well as what the fears are that we're dealing with. And what's very productive at the moment is recognizing that we're seeing experts in AI and in the humanities working together to try to figure out what the impact of AI is, trying to figure out whether we need regulation, how it's going to affect privacy, whether it threatens our democracy. And again, it's important to recognize that members of the technology community and people in industry think it shouldn't, a lot of them think it shouldn't be left to them alone to consider these points. And again, the topics we're dealing with aren't the obvious ones. It's not just about the ethics of AI, important though that is. We also have a sense that the black box technology of algorithms that we don't understand and some of the practitioners don't understand in producing their findings and their decisions, we want to render more intelligible. So what does intelligibility look like for the machines that are taking decisions on behalf of us in medicine, maybe in law, certainly in finance? So these are things that the humanities has skills to contribute to and to think about quite deeply. The third point is when we look at not just, as I've said, complementarity and the potential transformation of disciplines and discipline areas by the new technologies, but I think we have to move to what is significant interactions, genuine collaborations, where no side of, say, an arts and science and collaboration or humanities and science collaboration owns the area or can anticipate what the results are and the methods are that come out of their working together. And that's where we get really significant collaboration, and Marion touched on the importance of collaboration. And I think collaboration speeds up innovation. There are things which deciding for yourself what you're going to look at and talk about will make you miss some potential insights that are rewarding both for your discipline, but also for something that lies beyond the disciplines engaged in the inquiry, creating new research topics, new questions. So it's when methods collide, which is not always easy, and when they shake up some of the things that we've been doing hitherto, that I think will make real advances. So here's the case in engineering. Several engineers came to me when I was Arts and Humanities Leadership Fellow for the Science and Culture theme and said, look, we're engineers. We don't just want to build things. We want to change the world. And what we're interested in is not just measuring how people deal with our technologies or how they use new systems of public transport. We can measure their behavior. We want to know how they experience it. And we want to know what matters in that experience. Who do I go to? Who do I talk to? And that's not a question that's easy to answer. You recognize it's lying in the sphere of the human world and human experience, but who's going to do that? Well, together they might start to figure out how to do that together. And that means that people in the humanities might start using methods that were previously unfamiliar to them, experimental methods, which have been around in the humanities, but we might want to look at experiments to test people's experience and to have them experience and reflect on it, and then draw some new conclusions about the further way we pursue research. So to wrap all of this up, I want to come back to what seemed like the unhelpful remarks of government mentioned in the report. There have been slightly more helpful remarks of late. So if you look at the UK innovation strategy and sitting beneath it, the people and culture strategy that anticipates the workforce we need, the skills we need, the people we need to serve that new research infrastructure and ecology, there's a thought of, as we said, working across sector, working across disciplines, and an acknowledgement that research doesn't just go on in the universities, that it belongs in many other places, in museums and galleries, also in think tanks, in research institutions that lie outside. Now that means there'll be a whole set of skills, and the humanities will be very much part of that. And the Nurse report, Nurse 2, acknowledges it, as Nigel pointed out, quite firmly. So I think we can be cautiously optimistic that the humanities are needed, wanted, have a role to play. It's something that we have to contribute to. And when we talk about the UK as a scientific superpower, the people who've done serious work on that phrase and looked at scenarios of how that might be realized, Sarah Main and Graham Reed, they had the humanities as very much a core part of what they mean by that vision of a scientific superpower. And the School of Advanced Study partly sponsored that report, and have been in recent discussions with them about the consequences of it. So we have to have an experiential turn, an experimental turn, be slightly more entrepreneurial, but I'm confident that we're needed, and I'm confident other people think we're needed.
Thanks so much, Barry, and thank you all our panelists. Barry, I love the way that you picked up complementarity, turned to technology and AI, and then deepened it all by really challenging us to think about significant collaborations. We are a community of learners. We can experiment. That's what we do all the time. So I think that's a really important point. There are questions coming in, one of which actually, the second one, I'm going to rephrase very slightly because it reflects a question that I wanted to ask of all the panelists. Please do just pick it up and run with it. But one word that has been missing, or two words that have been missing pretty much from this discussion, are the arts in the humanities. And I'm thinking about creativity, creative practice, and making as ways of knowing and experimenting with the world. So this is very much your world as well, Barry. Something that we think about quite hard in the school as well. But perhaps I see Nigel nodding away at me there. Would you like to reflect on creativity as a word? It's always interesting the vocabulary that drops out of the conversation.
Yes, and I think Marion will want to come in on this, as well as that point about how we defined the scope, or how Marion defined the scope of the the HEPI report, which has kind of generated this discussion this evening. Creativity was a word that I was going to add in to my reflection on questions of value. And you can think about that, I think, as you say, Claire, in terms of the disciplinary value, creating as a way of knowing, as other ways, as a different way of undertaking research inquiry. Creativity is also a set of skills that we hope our students, our PhD students, graduates of the arts and humanities take out into the world with them. So it was certainly something that was kind of informing my thinking. It just didn't quite make it in there. Sort of creativity and communication, I think, are always two of those skills that we really must emphasize in terms of what we do. But I'll maybe pass over to Marion in terms of that. What I think the question is getting at, sort of how are we defining the scope of humanities or arts and humanities here this evening?
Thanks, Nigel. These are two really great questions to kick us off with, actually. And in relation to that first one, yes, I just think the arts, the practice-based arts subjects have an equally important, equally significant role to play, but it's a slightly different story. And I didn't feel in the report we could tell both stories simultaneously. I felt there needed to be more detailed emphasis on, sort of slightly different data sets, different components of those two stories. HEPI actually is publishing, I think, its next report. It was going to be on the arts. I think now it's more broadly on practice-based disciplines. So it's not that story is not important. It's not those stories are not allied, but they are different stories to tell. So I don't want to sort of preempt too much with the story we might tell about the arts, but just to say it's equally important, it's slightly different, and we need to get that narrative out there as well. But we were talking very much about the humanities rather than the practice-based arts subjects in that report. May I also segue a little bit to the second question, Claire, or do you want to stay on?
Yeah, I think it'd be nice. Sorry, Marion. I think it would be nice. Just want to invite the other panelists if they want to come in on the practice creative side of things. In part because one of the real insights of the REF outcomes, both in terms of outputs but also in terms of impacts, was how porous now creative practice is, and whilst we have across all the disciplines, and whilst it's absolutely critical to acknowledge and think through the institutional challenges of practice-based disciplines, it's also interesting to see them being taken up as a source of innovation in the field. I mean, Katherine, do you want to come in on that?
Well, I was going to say that I feel that the first and the second question go together in a way, because they're really questions about a disciplinary centre and sort of disciplinary boundaries between the humanities and the arts, between what we might think of traditional humanities and practice-based disciplines as well. And I think they speak to one of the questions that I often get asked is, is this classics? What counts as classics? So does performance, ways of exploring, say, Greek tragedy in modern performance, does that count as classics? Where are the boundaries? And I think we will serve ourselves if we adopt a relaxed attitude in terms of where those boundaries are, and allow boundary crossing work, while also paying attention to the very kind of subject specific skills agenda that we need to address, and also ensure that opportunities to engage in the traditional things that have given us our disciplinary centres are spread around the country. So I see those two questions as coming together and representing sort of two sides of this question of how practice and perhaps more traditional humanities interact. I don't know if that's
eloquently put, which allows me now to turn back to Marion to pick up the question about the relationship between interdisciplinarity, collaboration, challenge-led research, and the risk that the wager there that this is institutional practice that doesn't get communicated across. But Marion, please pick up that question and run with it.
I think it's absolutely the case that we can't have strong interdisciplinarity or strong multidisciplinarity without having strong disciplinarity. So it's very much not, I think, an either-or scenario. It has to be both. So I don't think there is a danger of losing a critical mass of disciplinary expertise through promoting and supporting interdisciplinarity. I think it's actually the direct opposite. I think we will be much better able to preserve disciplinary expertise if we look outwards. Lowering those boundaries, lowering those walls is not going to, getting that porosity is not going to make us vulnerable to attack. It's going to make us stronger. I really, really strongly believe that. I can't stress that enough. But I think there is another part to this question which it really is important for us to discuss. And I was very aware of it when writing this report. I'm very aware of it when I've been writing other things about what I'm calling radical interdisciplinarity, which is that it's not going to be great if we in the arts and humanities say, look, what we need is to collaborate across disciplines. We need to work across the STEM and SHAPE, as we have the new nomenclature for arts, humanities, social sciences. It's no good if we're saying that very strongly and STEM is saying, oh, STEM's all you need, right? Because it's going to make us look as if we are hitching our bandwagon to STEM, or we're sort of placing ourselves as the little bit the handmaiden to STEM, which is exactly the opposite of what we want, what we are trying to do with these arguments. So I think there is a bigger piece of work around a whole sector conversation around interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinary collaboration. But I don't think we'll find our STEM colleagues unreceptive to that. As was it Charles or was it Barry who was saying this, that, you know, they are reaching out to us as well. So I think we have to get almost a whole institutional story out about what universities can do and need to do for all of our disciplines collectively to thrive and to grow. We all have more impact by connecting with one another. The arts and humanities will extend the range of our work, its impact, and will grow our audiences through broad multidisciplinary collaboration.
It sounds like one pressing challenge for us, or one outcome of this panel, is to convene another panel where we really reach across all the disciplines. I think that would be really important. There's a question here from a colleague of ours, Jenny Richards, about precisely about what other actions we need to take to move forward. And the question is, there's been a lot of forward thinking in this panel, a recognition that we need to change as well as defend. Charles talked about moving forward across all the arts and humanities subjects. Well, how do we do that? I'm going to turn this question to you, Charles. What actions might follow from the many conversations that SAS has hosted today? I've put one on the agenda. I think there's also a very strong thread going through our questions and our reflections about practice-based research and experiment, a key word as well. So there are some real next steps that can be taken here to make sure that we convene an even wider group to get those messagings clear. But Charles, would you like to pick up and think about how we think in terms of whole communities, whole subjects?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think just picking up on one of the questions, I think from Amara Thornton, the question about the precarious nature of academic posts is very important. And I think this is something that impinges upon everything. It isn't simply that one should be doing one's research and then thinking about the context in which it is done. Research is the tool in which to think about the wider context and the infrastructure and the position of a subject, both as a subject and in the wider context and as a subject within a university. I think it's in thinking in those terms that one follows the spirit of the report and also can intervene very effectively on these issues. I think the report is excellent. I think it needs to be really thought about, digested, disseminated, and then to be built into the way in which we think about the activity and the momentum of subject associations and cross-subject associations, and the way in which we dovetail the work of the British Academy, HEPI, and institutions like the School of Advanced Study that make sure that we use our convening power in a way that is directed, not in a way that is overly prescriptive, of course not quite the reverse, but in the way that necessarily carries forward the momentum that is so much a part in thinking about the way in which we develop from this report and from the platform that we have.
Thank you, Charles. I'm minded to turn to Nigel at this point, because one of your key points was an invitation to think about institutional structures internally that enable this work to be scaled up. But there are also out with structures, the ones that Charles mentioned, learned societies, subject organisations. There's a huge landscape of learned societies of all kinds across our sectors, some of which never actually connect with the research community in very powerful ways. So there's the research councils as well. But I think that there's work to be done at home, as it were. Nigel, would you like to reflect on that for a minute?
I agree. I think there's some fantastic work happening in organizations like the School of Advanced Studies in convening discussions like this. There's been really brilliant work done by the British Academy and indeed by the other national academies, really working very closely together. And I think that was a feature of some of the initiatives that we saw sort of 2-3 years ago. And I think it's about continuing to sustain that momentum nationally. But I thought Katherine made a really important point about kind of where are we visible at institutional level, because in a way our strength nationally does rest on our strength within our individual institutions. Now I'm going to talk from a university perspective here, but I'm conscious that I think, as perhaps Charles or Barry said, research doesn't just happen in universities. We shouldn't think about humanities research just taking place within UOAs or schools, academic units within any university in the sector. Museums and galleries are research institutions. The government is a research institution. And we have a lot of charity, voluntary sectors, and indeed, of course, commercial organizations, which are also doing research in our fields. We pointed some of the obvious areas there are kind of the creative arts, which has been much discussed, but also heritage sectors and organizations like the National Trust, for instance. So there's a lot here, and I think we've got a lot of allies, but we do need to think about that. I'm conscious about thinking always about how we put our best foot forward and make these cases internally as well. I think, as Barry said, and I feel it in Newcastle all the time, my colleagues in STEM want to reach out. My colleagues in humanities and the arts and humanities and social sciences want to talk to their STEM colleagues. I will cite my colleague, Jenny Richards here, who said some really good work on this in the field of data, as actually being something about bringing people together so that we understand how to speak each other's languages. There's a big point there about we need to learn from each other here, because we don't naturally speak each other's languages, but we can learn to do that. And, I say that as a modern linguist, thinking about some of those skills. So I think there's something there. We all have interdisciplinary research centres. We all have institutes in our respective universities. I think it's one of the interesting things about the nurse report, that call, and I know NERSE is not talking about some of our kind of university-based institutes, but actually for that connectivity, for really recognising the work that is going on in there. So how do we join some of that up nationally? Or indeed, as I said in my intervention, thinking on a regional basis as well. It's one of the things that I think we started to do in the Northeast. We're 5 universities, so it's a relatively, it's a small group of universities. We work together on a range of things. How can we do more of that to share that complementarity? But I think there are a range of ways in which we're going to have to intersect. I don't think there's no one organization that can do this, and there's no one way of organizing this. It may look a bit messy from the outside, but I think we've got a clarity of purpose, I think, coming through this evening. I think that's what is going to take us forward.
Clarity of purpose, yes, indeed. Thank you. That's a great line and a great summary. I'm conscious in the Q&A that there's a thread, a discussion going on about schools and international reach and the access to learning and teaching. And I think that's something that Charles talked about as well. Barry, you have a comment that you want to say. You look like you're leaning towards the screen in a way that I recognize. I
am, yeah. I wanted to say something about what Nigel said and also Marion said. If we're going to have, the benefit of our STEM colleagues reaching out to us, there has to be time and resource to do interdisciplinary building up. It's hard won. I agree with Marion. Good interdisciplinary work starts from a strong disciplinary base because each side needs the other to bring their expertise, something that the others can't necessarily see. And as Nigel points out, there's a translation problem where you're going to be using some of the same terms and understanding them quite differently. And often when you work through that, you get to a new stage, which I call the conflict stage, where they say, no, this is what's important. These are the questions that matter. And then you have to work through that, and then you get to collaboration. So that takes time, and there has to be resource to make that possible, respecting the disciplinary expertise of each. I also just wanted to say that to all the comments in the chat about practice, and let's not forget practice, the sciences are actually also reaching out to people in the arts to look at practice. Here's something that doesn't often get mentioned. There's a kind of practice to doing science. There's a performance to conducting experiments. And in fact, people in the sciences know who's really good at performing experiments, who's really good at mixing the liquids in a chemistry lab. And they think there's a kind of skill that we don't teach and we don't talk about. And the papers we publish don't mention this dimension of it. And so, for example, Roger Kneebone at Imperial College has started a Center for Performance in Science, where he's inviting artists in to talk about the practice and to concentrate and focus on practice and see if scientists can be taught to pay attention to what's implicit in how they work. So I really think there is great scope for letting our colleagues in the sciences tell us what they're interested in, where we really have the expertise to help.
Thank you, Barry. I'm conscious of the time. It's 6:30, and I think we're at the moment of summary here. There's quite an active, as Barry's just pointed out, there's quite an active and rich strand of questions in the Q&A. I think we're picking them up all the way from precarity, employability, international, creativity, institutional, and cross-sector work. That amounts to a very complex narrative. It's not going to take one person or 6 people or 108 people that are on this call to do that. I encourage everybody to take back this discussion, add it to the conversations you're having in your own institutions, communities, disciplines, and in your own research, and come back with some concrete suggestions of your own, because there isn't a single answer here. It is a shared purpose, as Nigel put it. I'm going to go around. I'm going to put the panelists on the spot and come up with one word that they would like us to reflect more on in future discussions. I think my colleagues in SAS, we can take away where we want to take the conversation next. I know there's going to be some new work, some more writing, some more commissioning of reports. The work will go across all the funding agencies as well. But I'm going to start with, I'm going to go backwards. So I'll start with Barry. One word, keyword. I can't hear it.
In the context of talking about research, my one word is participatory.
Participatory, that's excellent. Katherine?
Inclusion.
Inclusion. This is an interesting experiment. Charles?
Connectivity.
Connectivity. Nigel?
Engagement.
Engagement. And Marion, finally.
Unification, in the sense that, if I may take a couple more words, it pains our souls because we're all rugged individuals and critical thinkers, but I think we have to just get a few key points. We all have to get behind them. So that's the only way we're going to land any of this beyond our own cohort.
Thank you so much, everybody. That was a fantastic, intense, pointed, focused discussion, and it proves that we can deliver a collective message. So thank you very much, everybody.